Yeah, today, my name is Dave. If we haven't met, it's good to see you. Today we are in week 7 of a series that we're doing called Jesus and the 10 Commandments. Today we're exploring commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery. And I just want to say good job to you because some of you looked ahead, you knew this was coming, you showed up anyway. You're like, adultery, let's go to the gorge today and go hiking. Nah, let's go to church. Good stuff. Okay. Now, this morning we're going to ask and answer some questions about this commandment. Why does this commandment matter? Why does it matter so much? Who is this commandment for? And then finally, how do we become people who keep the 7th commandment? We'll spend a lot of time there. How do we become people who kind of live into God's heart for this commandment? And so as we get into it, we've talked in this series about how often the 10 Commandments feel like a list of rules or prohibitions, a list of things not to do. Don't do this, don't do that, thou shalt not lie, steal, covet, kill. But the larger issue, the driving issue, the issue underneath all of these prohibitions is always a promotion. Something that God is for. Something he offers us, something that we are called to highly value. This is why last week when we talked about the prohibition of murder, the driving issue was actually the promotion of human life, the high value of people created in the image of God. And this week, as we talk about commandment number 7, we must understand that behind the prohibition of adultery is the compelling promotion of a marriage, and specifically, sex in marriage. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but God is kind of intense when it comes to sex in marriage. He's got some opinions. See, on the one hand, the Bible is extremely modest. Throughout the scriptures, we are told time and again, avoid sexual engagement of any kind outside of marriage. The author of Hebrews says it this way: marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure. For God will judge the adulterer and the sexually immoral. In Ephesians, it says it this way: but among you, and by the way, the you is plural there, it's the church, it's us, it's Jesus followers, but among you, there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality or of any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people, God's people who've been set apart for his name and by the salvation of his Son. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says it this way: flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside of the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And the idea here is that even though all sin is bad, it's not equally bad for you. You see, sometimes in our world, people like to justify their behavior or kind of create a loophole for themselves. And so they'll say something like, well, isn't all sin really the same in the eyes of God? We're all sinners and all sin's just equal and the same, right? One pastor I read this week said, all sin is equally damning, but not equally devastating. That's what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians. And so God uses emphatic language to put boundaries around sex and sexuality. So on one hand, Scripture can feel extremely conservative. But on the other, once a couple is married, the Bible is actually almost embarrassingly permissive. There are verses in Proverbs, I won't read this morning, that command men to be satisfied and intoxicated with their wives. That's all I'll say. Paul in Ephesians essentially says to married couples, if you're married, make sex a regular part of your lives together. Make it a priority. In the Song of Solomon, an entire book in the Old Testament, it's a book that celebrates sexual love. It's not preached on very often, but it's talked about in very graphic terms. In fact, in the 1950s, there was a man who did some research on what the American Puritans taught about sex from the scriptures, and then he wrote an article about it, but the Yale Review would not publish the article because it was too, and I quote, graphic and risque. The Puritans were more graphic and risque about sex than the Yale Review. Now, times have changed. Okay. But again, here's the point. When it comes to sex, the Bible is both radically restrictive and ferociously freeing. Why? Because to God, sex is a very big deal. See, we live in a culture that is confused about the significance of sex. On one hand, we know the devastating impact of sexual promiscuity and of abuse of any kind. Our culture, in a good way, has come to understand that a person's sexuality is deeply woven into them, and for that to be violated is hurtful and painful and damaging. Why? Because sex really matters. And yet, on the other hand, we also often treat sex as recreational fun for two consenting adults, as something that can be flippantly engaged in Vegas over the weekend or shared and bought and sold on the internet. But in contrast, friends, the Bible is courageously consistent in its message on sex. Its claim is that sex is immensely important always. And here's why. Sex, according to God, is the consummating act of the marriage covenant. You see, marriage is not just an agreement. Marriage is not just an arrangement. Marriage is not even just a contract. It's a covenant. And a covenant, friends, is a lifetime relational commitment between partners who make binding promises to work together for a common goal. That's pretty technical, but that's true. You see, a covenant is different from a contract in that a contract is often fiscally driven or behaviorally driven, while a covenant is relational and personal. And the defining factor of a biblical covenant is that it happens before God. You see, in a marriage covenant, I'm not just promising faithfulness and protection and provision to my wife. I'm not just committing to her. I'm committed to her and to him. Marriage is huge. Why? Because it is entered into before the creator of the universe. And sex is the consummating act of that marriage covenant. Sex is meant to finalize and bond a husband and wife together for life. Listen to this from Genesis chapter 2. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife. That's covenant. And they become one flesh. Consummation, covenant, and consummation. One scholar I know said it this way. Sex is the physical demonstration that you have given yourself to someone completely. It's saying emotionally, spiritually, relationally, financially, and now physically, we are one. Isn't that so good? I'm the scholar who wrote that. I just want you to know. I said a scholar I know, and I just wanted to be a scholar today. I liked it, and I wanted to make it a quote. So, okay, all right. That's the only joke in this whole sermon. Okay, here we go. Friends, there is so much scientific data to support this now, to support the power of the sexual commitment. What neuroscience is now clearly and powerfully teaching is that when you have sex or engage in sexual activity, there are chemicals and hormones released in your body. Dopamine, oxytocin, vasopressin. Google this later if you don't believe me. These chemicals bond you physically and emotionally to the person you are engaged with in more powerful ways than we could have ever imagined. And if you think I'm being extreme or that I'm overstating this, just consider what Jesus has to say about it. He didn't need neuroscience. He created neuroscience. Matthew chapter 5, this is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' words. You have heard that it was said, You shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. First of all, let's be clear here. Jesus is not saying that lust and adultery are the same thing. He's not saying a stare and an affair are equal. Like if you've done adultery in your heart, you might as well go ahead and do the whole thing because they're just the same thing anyway. No, not the message. What's happening here is that Jesus is speaking to some super self-righteous people who were tempted to believe that just because they had avoided certain sexual sins, they were all good on this commandment. They were superior to others who had failed. Not that this would ever happen in our world today. Not that super religious people would get focused on certain sexual sins to the exclusion of their sexual sins and then be all self-righteous. We can't relate. Or maybe we can. You see, Jesus is really getting at this question. Who is this commandment for? And right away, with some amazing verbal karate, Jesus levels the playing field, doesn't he? He asks, how many of you in here wrestle with adultery? Show of hands to the crowd, right? And then he says, okay, 2 of you, right, whatever. Let me rephrase the question. How many of you have ever struggled with lust? And now everyone's raising their hand. See, Jesus is making this point. Every single one of us wrestles with sexual sin because all of us have to deal with brokenness in our lives, brokenness in our sexuality in some way. And when I say all of us, I mean all of us. Maybe for you, it's masturbation. Maybe for you, it's pornography. Maybe it's feelings of attraction for someone who's married or for a person of the same sex. Maybe you're single and you wonder what sexual fulfillment and experience looks like for you in your life, and you wrestle with that. Or maybe your struggle is that your sexual desire is low, and being intimate and vulnerable in this way is hard for you, even in your marriage. Maybe your spouse wants more from you than you feel you can give, or vice versa. Or maybe for you, there's a past of choices and decisions that you regret. Or maybe there was even abuse that has damaged you and made this whole entire subject extremely painful and difficult. Friends, what I want you to hear and understand today is that you, whoever you are and whatever you've been through, are not alone in this room. All of us, every single person in this space will struggle with sex and sexuality in some way at some point. Jesus is telling us that this is not a those people problem, it's an us people problem. I'll stop here and say that if you struggle or if you're hurting, there's help. We have groups here. 423, Betrayal and Beyond, Mending the Soul. All of these are great places to find help and healing. Jump on our website, go to Care Ministries, look it up, do some reading, do some research. Get the help you need. Because this is serious stuff. Listen to what Jesus says next. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. I want to spend the last part of our message today talking about how. How do we do this? How do we become people who keep the 7th commandment, who understand the heart of the 7th commandment, the heart of God in it, and who walk in that way? I have 7 tips to close the message today. My kids make fun of me all the time that I have lots of tips. Like, Dad, you have more tips than anyone. Well, I got 7 today, and they're not just for my kids, they're for you guys. Here we go. Here's the first. Ask yourself, again, how do we become people who keep the 7th commandment? Ask yourself, where will this lead me? I'm amazed at people's inability to ask this question, to think this out. When I was a physics major in college, we would often do labs. And in our labs, you would collect data points. And then, quite often, you'd be asked to extrapolate those data points to kind of see where the data was taking you. You'd kind of say, here's what we know, here's where it's headed. And friends, we must learn to do the same thing in our sexual lives. Twice in this passage, Jesus says, it is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Again, this is review. If you were here last week, the word Jesus uses for hell is again the word Gehenna. And it's the dump. It was like the city dump on the southwest side of Jerusalem where trash was burned and dead and decaying rotten animals were discarded. Again, this is a culture where everyone butchered their own meat. Can you imagine the smell of the city dump in Jerusalem? It was an awful, foul, horrible place to be. Here's Jesus' message. When we allow sexual sin to simmer and stay and set up shop in our lives, it's going to create all sorts of decay and destruction. This is a warning from Jesus. He's warning us to help us. Young people, hear me. Listen, sometimes we think the world offers the good life in this area and that the Jesus way seems a whole lot less fun. But in the end, over time, following Jesus will save you from hurt and pain and struggle that I promise you, you want no part of. Jesus gives his instruction on sex here in the midst of a sermon that is ultimately about the blessed life. That's how he starts the message, right? Blessed are these people, and blessed are those people, and blessed are people who live this way. They will find true joy and satisfaction in their lives. This is how you can have blessing. Isn't that what you want? Sure, sexual sin is fun in the moment, but where is it taking you? And what will the result ultimately be? Extrapolate the data. Number two. Tip 2, practice commandment 1. I preached a whole sermon already on this one, right? You guys remember what commandment 1 is? You shall have no other gods before me. Friends, it is impossible to break commandment 7 without breaking commandment 1 first. No one is just cruising along like, God's number 1 in my life. God's my highest priority. He's Savior and Lord and King, and then oops, adultery. That is not a thing. Check this out. When Jesus says, I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That word lustfully is the Greek word epithumeo. Epithumeo. It means to attempt to use something or someone to satisfy your soul in a way it was not intended to. Now you can apply that to a lot of things, right? But Jesus in this context is saying, be really careful about trying to use a woman or a person or sex or some relationship to satisfy your soul in the way that God can only do it. Adultery happens when we break commandment 1 and something else has become God instead of God. Sex has become God, or that person has become God, or this relationship has become God. Tip 3, understand that it starts with your eyes. Jesus says in our passage, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. By the way, he only mentions right. He says, if your right eye, right hand, why does he say right? Because in the ancient world, the right side of the body was the honored side. It was the best side. This is why you stand. This is like why people are saying, can we stand at the right hand of the Father? That's like the best, right? All you left-handed people out there are bummed right now, but it's just biblical. Right-handed people are better. No, they're not. We're all the same. But the right side was he's like, even if your most valued hand causes you to sin, cut it off, right? Now, in a sense, Jesus is being hyperbolic here. I hope you know that. No one should go home and cut off anything. I want to be clear. He's being hyperbolic, but he's also being practical. He's saying the problem starts with how you use your eyes. What you look at and what you allow to enter your brain. At the beginning of this passage, he says, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in her heart." That word looks is a word that means to look and to keep on looking. In other words, Jesus is saying, don't take a second look. Don't let it simmer in your mind. Be really careful about what images and thoughts you allow to move through your eyes and simmer in your brain. This is a hard one. It's a hard one in the world that we live in. And yet, this is where the roots of adultery and sexual sin begin to grow. Through your eyes and in your mind. Tip 4, don't practice for failure. Jesus says, and if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. He's saying here, if sexual temptation has moved from your eyes and your mind to being practiced by your body, that should be a big warning to you. Red lights should be flashing. Let me say it this way. If you're an athlete or an actor or a musician, you are, of course, careful to practice your craft in the right way. Aren't you? Why? Because when you get in the game or the show or the concert, you will likely perform in the same way you've practiced. Singles, let me talk to you for a second. I mean, I know you think maybe this sermon is for married people. It's not. It's for you too. Singles, why would you spend your single life exhibiting no sexual self-control? Some of you say, well, I'm just trying to have a little fun before I get married. I'm trying to sow my wild oats. I'm trying to get it all out of my system. No. You're practicing habits that will lead to adultery. Because sleeping with multiple people does not prepare you to be faithful to one person. Earlier, I talked about asking, where will this lead me? Where will sexual sin lead me? This tip is kind of that tip in reverse. It's looking ahead at what you want in life, where you want to go, and then practicing the things that will get you there. Practice for the win. Practice for success. Do you want a spouse and a family and trust and intimacy? Do you want to sit next to your wife at your kid's wedding holding hands? Do you want to stand before God someday as someone who was faithful with this very sacred area of your life? Then don't practice the wrong things. Okay, number 5. Understand your temptations. Understand your temptations. The key phrase of Jesus' teaching here is a phrase he uses twice. Causes you to stumble. He says, if this causes you to stumble, if that causes you to stumble, right? If your right eye if your right hand causes you to stumble. That phrase, causes you to stumble, is one Greek word, scandalizo. It's where we get our English word, scandal. Jesus is saying here, understand, see clearly what will throw your life into scandal. In the first century, the word scandalizo was used to describe a long stick with bait on it that was meant to lure an animal into a trap. A scandalizo lured an animal into its own destruction. It was also used to describe something put in someone's path to deliberately make them trip. Bandits would do this in the ancient world. Bandits would stretch a cord across a path or dig a trench and then cover it up with a thin layer of branches. And then when an unsuspecting victim walking along would come past and trip, the bandits would use this moment to jump out and attack them. Friends, Jesus is saying here, be real aware of what might trip you up sexually. Think about what has the tempting power to lure you into scandal. What is tempting to you? Understand yourself and then put some boundaries in your life. Create some space between you and temptation. Understand your temptations. Tip 6, serve and submit to one another's needs. This tip is primarily for married couples. Friends, the reason adultery hits the top 10 list, the 10 commandments, the reason Jesus spends valuable time in the Sermon on the Mount teaching about sexuality and sin and lust is because this stuff is hard. Jesus doesn't talk a lot about things. He doesn't go on and teach about stuff that just is real easy for you and me. He doesn't waste time on that stuff. He teaches into things that are complicated and difficult, and he knows that sex and sexuality are complicated and difficult. And I say that to set some of you free today. Free from the guilt and shame of this not being an easy area for you. You see, too often, I think the message of the church is, if you're a real Christian, this stuff is easy. Or if you just resist certain behaviors until you're married, then everything will be perfect. And not only will you have no sexual temptation, all your sexual desires will be wonderfully met for the rest of your life. Let's just take a quick poll. Married people. No, I'm not going to do that to you. And so many of you sit out there and you think, why is this so hard for me? What's wrong with me? Why is purity so hard for me? Why is intimacy so hard for me? Why, even though I'm a Christian, do I still struggle with this stuff? Friends, let me tell you the answer. Sin, the fall, the devil, your flesh. Remember in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve are just first created and they're just chilling together in paradise, hanging out? God creates them, and then it says what? It says they're just hanging out in the garden, naked and not ashamed. There's just full-on nudist colony up in there. They're just loving it, right? Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Friends, this statement means something far more than they had really good body image. This is not and Adam had a six-pack and Eve had whatever, and not going to go there, but the statement, naked and they felt no shame, is really a statement about the ease with which they experienced vulnerability and intimacy and oneness and connection with each other. It was not hard. In the garden, it was simple and easy and natural. It just flowed. But then came the fall, and sin and brokenness and corruption and insecurity. And before you know it, Adam and Eve are covering up and hiding. Friends, the scriptures are explaining our lives to us. The Bible explains your life to you better than anything else in the world when you understand it. The Bible is saying to us here, we now live in a world where sex and intimacy is difficult, where connection and transparency and vulnerability, even for husbands and wives, will not always be easy and natural. Let me tell you unmarried people out there something. Marriage is great. Uniting your life with another person is a wonderfully good thing. Amy and I are coming up on 25 years. I know for some of you that's half, so I don't need your condescending looks, but we're pretty pumped. 25 years. It's amazing. It's wonderful. And it's hard. And it's tough, and it will wreck you at times. But married people, back to you, work at it. Work at it, make it a priority. Chances are one of you will want more sex and the other will desire less. By the way, it's not always the guy, 80-20. So you ladies who are in the 20%, you're not alone. Chances are one wants more, one desires less. Chances are one of you will connect emotionally and conversationally more easy than the other. I was just talking to a friend about that this morning, right? Here, do what Paul says. Here's a thought. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That means dial it back a little for your spouse if they need you to. Or rev it up for your spouse a little if they need you to. In other words, Do nothing out of selfish ambition, this is Philippians, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, rather in humility value others, specifically your spouse, above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the other. Do you know why this is hard? Because we're selfish. Because I want what I want, and I think I'm right, and I'm willing to connive and scheme and manipulate and do whatever I need to do to get my needs met. And yet it's not the Jesus way. Serve and submit to one another's needs. This leads to the final and perhaps most powerful tip. 7, lean into the forgiving and transforming power of the gospel. Maybe there's not an area in our world that we need the gospel more than in this area. And not just a little bit of the gospel, not like a thin, trite version of the gospel, like the full, complete power of the gospel. Lean into the forgiving and transforming power of the gospel. In John chapter 8, some very religious people bring Jesus a woman caught in adultery. She's cheating on her husband, and they catch her. They find her, they grab her, and they drag her down to Jesus. And they ask him, what should we do with this woman, Jesus? Should we stone her like the law of Moses says we should? Instead of answering directly, Jesus responds by saying, let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And then, not surprisingly, all the people present slowly but surely turn and walk away. And now it's just Jesus and this woman, and he says 2 very powerful things to her. 2 significant things to this woman, this adulterer. First, he tells her, I do not condemn you. I do not condemn you. The God of the universe looked into the eyes of this woman who, for reasons unknown, is cheating on her husband, and he says, I do not condemn you. Some of you need to hear that from God today. I do not condemn you. I do not hold your sin against you. I do not see the mistake that you have made in your life as the most defining moment of your life. That mistake does not define you, Jesus says. I want to define you. My grace will define you. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Then he says something else to her. He says, go now and leave your life of sin. You see, what Jesus longs for this woman to experience is what I believe God longs every single one of us to experience. The power of his gospel to forgive us, and the power of his gospel to change us. See, it's the power of grace, and then it's the power to live differently than we have in the past. And so, friends, this morning, let me ask you, do you need God's grace today? Do you need his mercy? Do you need him to look into your eyes and say, I do not condemn you? And do you need God's power today to walk out of here and live differently, live changed, live transformed, live not in your own power and strength, but in his power and strength to walk in holiness and righteousness in this sexually corrupt world? This morning, we're going to share the Lord's Supper. And here's what I just want to invite you to do today. As we prepare to come to the tables and get the elements, bring them back to our seats, and then we'll share the meal together in just a moment. But as you prepare for that, let me just give you a minute to look again over this list and to just ask yourself, where do I need God's grace? Where on this list do I need God's mercy to speak into my mind and heart and offer me forgiveness, maybe forgiveness that I haven't received yet? Where do I need God's grace today? And where do I need God's power today? Where do I need the power to change and the power to transform and the power to not just walk out of here forgiven and do the same things over again? Where do I need the gospel to forgive me? And where do I need the gospel to transform me? That's the invitation of our Lord today to us, God's holy people. made righteous and clean and holy by the death and resurrection of Jesus, and empowered by that same death and resurrection to live differently with his Spirit in you and me. Take a moment, and when you're ready, the tables are open.